Your internet is a little shaky, Jay.
Oh dear. Well,
Yeah.
let me welcome the discussion. We're here with Perry Mehrling to discuss his book Money and Empire, Charles Kindleberger, The Dollar System. Perry, thanks very much for joining us. The Money Reading Group has been reading your book over the last couple of weeks. We had very extensive conversations, and we've had the benefit of you actually listening in to the recordings. The first two sessions in particular, but those were also very extensive and very at times, intriguing, surprising to you perhaps about what we were picking up from the book. Before the overall discussion, maybe we can allow you, Perry, to sort of reflect on what you thought of our discussion, what surprised you, what things you might want to clarify or bring up. But over to you, Perry. Thanks very much for writing the book. And of course, before we get started, I think we can all congratulate you for this tremendous body of work of telling the story of Charlie and giving us, at least for me personally, I can say this, a much better grasp of this take. I think for my personally, this take of extending the money view into this international setting and actually firmly rooting it, I think this has become a new core, maybe in your own thinking, that is that it wasn't in the MOOC or previously. So I think this is a tremendous leap forward, and I think we really want to appreciate all the nuance that comes with this approach, this thinking, when it comes to accounting standards, when it comes to the institutional setting that we need to develop with a lot of concepts that are going to challenge our conventional wisdom on a lot of different counts. So I think it's a very helpful conversation. We can then see how far it takes us, whether or not we can really rely on these frameworks in the real world setting, in a political setting we have today or any time. But I think this is a tremendous contribution. So thank you, Perry, on behalf of the group for making that. And yeah, with that, over to you, Perry, and we'll hear your reflections first.
Well, thank you for reading it and taking it seriously and studying it. I found listening to your conversation, you always wonder, how people are going to read the book, and it's written for multiple audiences. But I suppose my key target audience was, in fact, you, young graduate student, whatever, practitioners. But I think people don't really sort of change their minds after they're 30. So you want to get them before they're 30, if you're trying to influence things. I would repeat, which I know I've said to you many times, that you should maybe have in mind that the book is sort of an iceberg, that only 10% of it is above the surface. I tried to write a short book, and I'm doing spin-offs afterwards that will be maybe more sharply worded. Okay, and so maybe even today is the beginning of a third spin-off. I already did this thing just last week in Rome on the why is the key currency approach a minority view, and some of that comes out of this book. What was his challenge in communicating to economists. I'm doing another one at the ASSA meetings. If some of you go there, you'll see I'm giving a talk there on Minsky and Kindleberger. Many people ask me what's the connection, and so I thought, well, it's sort of in the book, but it's not it's not in one place and drawn out. So I wrote that. The main thing that I wanted to emphasize maybe was that in my mind the main contribution of the book, the main thing I got out of the book, was a revisionist understanding of the history of the international monetary system that is different from the standard one, and that's why I wrote this little document, which maybe I can share my screen and show it to you. Do I have the ability to?
Yeah, go ahead. Should be fine.
Yeah, I'm going to share it right now. Let me say a few words about that. The point being that although the book sort of looks like a biography of a man, it actually is intended to be the story of the evolution of the international monetary system through the eyes of this man, that the times that he lived in, and that he's trying to understand it in real time. And so you see him, trying to figure out what's going on in the 60s and what's going to happen after Nixon 71 and so forth. And this also is an important learning to appreciate that this Darwinian evolutionary institutional understanding of the world, that it's open-ended, that this isn't an equilibrium system. And so we're trying to understand it as it's changing qualitatively, not just quantitatively. And what methods are appropriate for that. And you can see, I know you've just read the last 3 chapters, he's pretty down on standard economics. After he gets out of MIT, right, he says, really the ability of economics to forecast or to manage, he thinks is very primitive, and that economists have way too much, they're not humble enough about the tools they have, and they are that there's very little that we know in general about economies. In fact, if we are honest with ourselves, but what do we know? And that's what he's trying to do in these last 3 books, is kind of say, well, what can we actually say? So it's a critique of economic thought, and I think most of his criticisms are well taken today as well. So it's not that economics has changed since he was active. It's actually probably become more so. So and its response to the great global financial crisis has largely been ringing the wagons, and not saying, oh my goodness, we didn't see this coming, we didn't know what to do, maybe we should do economics differently. It hasn't really responded in that way. So he would, I think that by entering his mind, you can ask yourself, what would he say about economics today? I know, so 2 questions. In the second session, people repeatedly are kind of annoyed by the biography, and they like the chapters on economics. So I want to push back on that a little bit, okay, and to say that you should understand where that feeling is coming from. It's because you're an economist and you're annoyed by history, okay. And you should. I'm not going to give in to that, that this is the point, that economics needs more of a historical sensibility, that economists have a historical sensibility trained out of them, that there's some idea that we can understand the economy sort of through and deductive methods, or that the latest issue of the JPE has the latest economic knowledge, okay, and we don't really need to read it. I remember in graduate school, I was specifically told, like, you don't need to read anything that's older than 2 years old, okay, that everything that's relevant is in the last 2 years of the journals. And I think that is a big disservice to students, okay. And so that historical sensibility is a valuable skill in understanding the present world. And so I'm doing it through biography, through the lens of one person, but it's actually economic history more generally. And so pushing back on that. And the other thing I'll say before pulling up this thing is about, somebody was a little critical about the wishy-washy liberalism of me and of Charlie. Was that you, Matthew? Okay. I don't know whether I'm a wishy-washy liberal, maybe I am. You should be careful not to identify me and Charlie. This always happens with my books. People think that I am a follower of Fisher Black. In fact, they thought I was a turncoat because I wrote a biography of Fisher Black, and that I'd somehow abandoned my previous beliefs. And now probably the people who think I follow Fisher Black think I'm a turncoat, that I'm now abandoned and I follow Charlie Kindleberger. It is a professional drawback of this strategy of getting deeply inside the mind of a man, that you do a little mind meld in order to, and then telling the world what it feels like to be Charlie. Okay, so but I'm not in fact, I am trying my next book to really write an analytical thing on the money view, which he was unable to do because he really didn't have the math or all of it. And I think that's one of the reasons that it wasn't understood, and it was frustrating to him. So then you'll see that I'm not exactly Charlie, because I'm not really an economic historian. I use this as a method for doing this. He, his politics, he was a globalist New Dealer. Okay, that's, I think, what I want to emphasize. I don't think of that as wishy-washy liberalism really at all. It's the globalist aspect of it is important. Most of the New Dealers became sort of nationalist, and they were not globalist, but there was a group of them, and they did not carry the day with Roosevelt, but there was sufficient number of them that they were a group. And Angel was one of them, for example, and as was Dupre and his other colleagues. He comes from a place of privilege of he was a Republican father, upper middle class, really boarding school, white, all of these esteemed ancestors and all of that, but they lost all their money, and so in the Depression, and so he had to really make his own way. He really was working for a living for most of his life, and not making very much money, at MIT, as a matter of fact. So he worked for a living. He was not an upper middle class person in his life, although his daughters tell me that they only started to have money after he retired, because Money's Panics and Crashes sold really pretty well, okay, but not when he was a professor. And he avoided making money. I don't know if you noticed this point. Maybe didn't even put it in the book, but in his autobiography, he talks about doing a consulting gig. There were these people doing consulting for some oil companies, and he got dragged into this, and they wrote him a check for $3,000 for doing basically 15-minute talk in Texas, and he thought that was kind of absurd, and he didn't do it again. But he could have made money by doing that sort of thing. All his colleagues were doing it, but he stuck to his loom, and he wrote these books instead, at considerable cost to his family, and I think monetary cost as well. He was a scholar. That's another thing to emphasize, as opposed to somebody like Triffin, who really is kind of, a crusader, an activist, not really a scholar kind of person. I had a conversation with Ivo Mays, who wrote the biography of Triffin in Rome, and he's read the chapter on Triffin and isn't all that happy about it. But he wondered whether maybe Kindleberger had some personal antipathy to Triffin, and that's why he didn't appreciate how great Triffin was. And I said, well, I think he did have some personal antipathy to him, but I think that's because of the way Triffin dealt with the world, that he was not a scholar. He was not listening to other people. He thought he knew he was a crusader. He thought he knew what was right. Charlie didn't really feel that he knew what was right in general, that he's trying to figure it out. So if I want this thing to be I wonder whether whether somehow you missed that this was a revisionist history. So I'm now screen sharing here. And I guess you all have copies of that document too, so you can you don't have to screenshot it or something. I wanted to put maybe I'll put this on my website too. On the website, I told Jay there's also now a section on the website which has sort of chapter summaries and pictures and also quotable Kindleberger. So he really was a wordsmith, and so there's a lot of fun quotes there. So if you can play with this, or if you're teaching it or something, but this is not on the website yet, but it will be. So the left-hand column I take to be, I'm trying to kind of say what do people think about, what does for example Eichengreen say about the history of the international monetary system. And this isn't meant to be a critique, it's meant to be a description of what people in general say. They kind of start the conversation. In fact, Zoltan did this, at Credit Suisse, Zurich last month. He started with Bretton Woods, 1944. And there's all this conversation about Keynes versus White. Those are the major figures. And all of that is in the context of national income and product accounts, which is what the post-war Keynesians talked of. The IMF is really about trade, current account, and not about capital flows. After the war, because the US sort of took care of Europe, the IMF developed moved into the developing countries business. And that's where Triffin kind of joined in with them. And Triffin always thought that he was sort of that the dollar was an absurd system, and that the IMF was supposed to have been the world central bank, and somehow the US prevented it from becoming that. And so that he was a crusader for the originalism, that the IMF should be the world central bank and the SDR should be the world currency. The economists all got enthusiastic about flexible exchange rates as a way of creating a policy space for monetary policy independence. 71 is described as the collapse of Bretton Woods, that often it's that there was something wrong with Bretton Woods in its original conception, and so it eventually collapsed out of its own weight. That's certainly Triffin's view, that shows he was right. That Bretton Woods collapse showed that he was right. And then there's the story about Volcker. How do we understand the Volcker shock? How do we understand these various international meetings? And the last six things are just sort of conceptual frames, that when people talk about the international reserve currency, they tend to think about this thing as a liability of the Fed, that it's the public dollar, and that the Fed is the US central bank. So this is a domestic dollar that's being used by foreigners, conceivably. The triple coincidence is part of everyone's more or less view of the world. I'm taking this from the BIS. I think most of you read that article. And the Mundell trilemma is also that you can only have two of those three things. The breakdown of Bretton Woods was choosing a different two than you had before that. Outside the US, there's a view that the dollar, that the US gains from the use of the reserve currency, that's an exorbitant privilege. That's the French view, but not just the French view, the Belgian view too, if I may say, to say Triffin, okay, in this regard. And farther down the hierarchy, I heard there was some talk about the sort of privileged position, looking at it from, the Africa is pretty far down the hierarchy. It is. And so the new international economic order, the demand for a new Bretton Woods or something like that in the 70s is still alive. And if you go to UNCTAD, the demands are more or less the same as they were in 1974. So all of that is meant to be just a summary. And if I've got that summary wrong, it would be nice to be corrected before I go live with it. But I think this is sort of, maybe turn that into a document instead of a list of things, but all of those things. And so I'm just counterposing them with a different story of the international monetary system, okay? That it didn't emerge from a treaty, but it emerged from practice, banking practice, and that the shape of it is determined by the economic logic of key currency. That the same reason that it's a good idea to have one currency inside the United States is the reason that it's good to have one currency in the world. And so the world is sort of trying to achieve that, okay, in bottom-up sort of ways. But politics is often an obstacle. I would start, in this view of the world, you sort of start, I suppose, with 1931, when sterling was pushed off gold. And then there's an attempt in the 1933 World Economic Conference, 1936 Tripartite Agreement. These are the things that happened during Charlie's graduate career, where these are emerging, these are efforts of central bankers, okay, not of finance ministers. And they are efforts of central bankers to solve a practical problem with global banking, as a matter of fact. So that's the sense in which the international monetary system is emerging from practice. They're not trying to impose this. They're trying to rationalize it, and the politicians won't let them do this. Instead of Keynes and White, the key person in this way of understanding the world is John H. Williams, and that's a sort of money view of the world, not a NEPA view of the world. At the end of chapter 9, I try to sort of wrap up and say in what sense Kindleberger is a money viewer, and following the viewing this book, The Financial History, as his attempt to write a treatise. So what are the tenets of that treatise? So that's where I bring this together. So it's not the IMF that's the important institution here, but the BIS, because that's the location of central bank cooperation. So the swap lines and so forth that were initially on the balance sheet of the BIS now are on the balance sheet of the Fed. The World Bank is the important institution because it's about long-term capital flows to the global South, not the IMF. The Anglo-American loan, the Marshall Plan after the war, these are the important things for getting the dollar system up and running, and the IMF is a sideshow, maybe be wrapped in later on, and so the dollar system, fixed exchange rates. Charlie always viewed 1971 as a crime. That this is not the collapse of Bretton Woods. This is Nixon torpedoing, for stupid reasons, for domestic reasons, for political reasons. It's not, it could have worked. It was working, he thought, right? So it's not the system collapsing under its own weight. And the important thing about Volcker is not so much that he whipped domestic inflation as that he basically re-established the US as taking some responsibility for leadership in the global dollar system. And that's a good thing. It's a good thing for the world. And Plaza is about restoring followership, not about multilateral agreements, really, in his view. The global dollar is a private dollar. It's the liability of Credit Suisse, not the liability of the Fed. It's an offshore dollar. Single money in capital market, not triple coincidence. There is no trilemma. There's only a dilemma. Capital controls or not capital controls, basically. That you don't get monetary independence from flexible exchange rates. That there's one monetary policy in the world, and it's U.S. monetary policy. And that's no matter who you are. That's what it is. And the U.S. This is a burden to do this, but it's a good thing for the U.S. to do this. It should be shared. And that's what he was saying at the end of his life, if you've read the last three chapters. And it is being shared now. I mean, the fact that we always talk about the C6, right? So that's the sharing part that's happening. It's not really the Fed that is the central banker of the world. It's this committee of the top 6 central banks that are providing this public good. It's not reached down beyond the top 6, really, but it could, conceivably, or it could, maybe we could build out more of that process in the future. I suspect that that's what's going to be happen as a result of the debt troubles that are all around us now in the periphery. After this 10 years of credit expansion in dollars, there's a reckoning that's happening. And so what will emerge from that will be another layer of this global dollar system that will have to be invented in the process. So this is more or less just, I've talked too long now. I mean, I just wanted to really, this is to me, the arc of the book is a story, is a revisionist history of the international monetary system through the eyes of Kindleberger, through the eyes of the key currency approach. And I hope that, I'm hoping that you could see that. I'm not sure that you could. Possibly I'm trying to sneak this. I'm not trying to display this as a revisionist anything, right? So that people won't attack it. They'll say, oh, Charlie Kindleberger, he was a great person. Let me read this book. And they will then absorb and realize, like, maybe there's lessons here. It's not just that he was a wonderful person, but there's lessons. So that's my hope, is that Kindleberger can be a kind of Trojan horse to get my monetary into the fort beyond the economics is very, very well defended. And so you need a way to get inside the citadel, or you just get trashed. That's been my experience. Charlie had that problem too. He had a way of getting inside the citadel, and that's what this story is about. How did he manage his resilience, his beautiful writing, his jokey, waspy character? All of these are mechanisms for surviving in a world that is kind of hostile to his way of thinking about the world.
So before you said that you are not Kindleberger and we shouldn't confuse you for Kindleberger, although it's understandable that we might. And now you're saying that you're using this story as a way to sneak your own view into economics. So I'm curious about what you might say are the biggest differences between you and Kindleberger.
Well, certainly the analytical side, that I'm very much focused on these two ideas in the money view, the survival constraint as the ultimate discipline that creates order in a market economy. So not the price system, okay, but the settlement system is what creates order and I don't think he ever articulated anything as precise as that. Similarly, the centrality of the dealer function, he knew about shiftability and so forth, and he knew about foreign exchange markets and forward markets and so forth, but he didn't really make a connection to equity markets and bond markets in general and so forth. So it's modern finance. I think he had no idea at all about modern finance, and so that held him back from understanding the modern world. That's why I did Fisher Black, right? Because I felt I have to understand modern finance, or I'm not going to be of any use to anybody, as a monetary economist in the modern world. And so if that takes me 10 years, that takes me 10 years, and then I can do monetary economics again. So those are certainly features.
What did he say and think that you disagree with?
Well, he said various things over. He, for example, in 1971, he thought there was going to be a Great Depression, and he didn't believe his own theory enough that bankers are going to find a way to sort this, to figure out how to keep the thing going. He was very surprised by that, okay, by the resilience of the international monetary system, that capital flows continued in the 70s. Really, it was quite amazed by that, okay, and I think that probably is because he didn't know enough about the global capital markets and he was viewing everything through the lens of growing up in the 1930s. I grew up in the 1970s, really. That's what made me into an economist, I suppose. And so that's different. And where would I disagree with him? I always find he has useful insights. He thought that the Fed would never be the world central bank, he wanted the BIS to become the world central bank. You must have caught that. So not the IMF, the BIS, and operate in the offshore market, okay, in the Eurodollar market. I think he was very surprised by that he would be very surprised that the Fed is now de facto the world central bank, that it has these swap lines, that it used them with alacrity. I think that all would have surprised him, that he thought that the political obstacles were overwhelming that would prevent the Fed from operating pretty explicitly as the world central bank. That seems not to be true. It was quite surprising to me. There was a lot of pushback after the global financial crisis, But there was no pushback after COVID 2020, that like, oh, we just activated the swap lines. No, but there was no congressional hearing about this. No one asked why the Fed did this sort of things that it did, even though it did many things that it hadn't done before with corporate bonds and so forth. There was no one pushing back on that. So I think de facto the Fed is now through its relations with other central banks, the global central bank. We'll see if it works. I've written about some of this also. I think that having this greater analytical structure does make me more confident that economists, have things to say. I think the money view can help you figure out what about policy and about what's happening in the world. You can understand in real time. It's there's more cutting edge than that. He was very down on economics, and I suppose I'm down on economics too. I think dynamic stochastic general equilibrium is not really very helpful at all for understanding any monetary things, and I don't think Diamond-Dybvig is helpful at all. I never teach it. But there are things that we can know. He was very late coming. Charlie was very late coming to appreciate Hawtrey, although he learned Hawtrey. He learned Hawtrey in the 30s. Studied him. I think I mentioned that in the book, that he says nice things about Hawtrey in the Financial History, but nothing before that. And some of that's because Hawtrey got a bad name. He thought you could get out of the Great Depression by having central bank cooperation to expand monetary policy in the 30s, and he was trying to achieve that. That's what the World Conference was about in 33. Probably that's wrong. Probably that's pushing on a string, and it wouldn't have worked. Okay, so that's why he turned away from Hawtrey. But I think that was a mistake. That there's a lot of wisdom in those people, so he abandoned his monetary education. He also turned away from Willis. He often would say that, but he learned more from Willis than he would admit. That's what I'm showing you, because he was against the laissez-faire aspect of the real bills doctrine, right? And so he was an activist. He's a New Dealer, and so he's reacting against Willis's sort of political conservatism. But Willis knew things about banking that he taught to Kindleberger, and I think he's much more in this regard, much more a student of Willis than he is of Angel, and that's what I'm trying to show, and also I guess of John H. Williams, more than he realizes himself. I don't see myself as your question, like where do I disagree with him? You can sort of see my answer is that I'm trying to build on him. Rather than saying, well, where is he wrong? Say, how can we use this way of thinking how can we build that out? How can we, for the modern world, how can we use that? What parts of it can we use?
Yeah, it seems like the only areas where you disagree with him are the ones that history has shown are already wrong, almost.
Well, so he changed his mind about things, and I hope that I can change my mind about things too a little bit.
Yeah. And the reason you don't like Diamond-Dybvig is that just because it doesn't incorporate the survival constraint in.
It's not a model of banking at all. It's that banks, the key banking operation is a swap of IOUs. Okay, there's no swap of IOUs there. There's no swap of IOUs. These are real investments, okay, that are illiquid. Okay, and that's the problem. Okay, whereas in real banking, the problem is not that the illiquidity comes from the fact that your assets are time-dated promises to pay and your liabilities are time-dated promises to pay, and those times aren't lined up. So that's the problem. Okay, but they're both promises to pay. They're not real investments. And I think that if you start with if you start with Diamond Dybvig, you're never going to understand banking. That's why I don't let students read it. And then you can read it later on after you understand something about banking, but it's not a good place to start. You know, for I would never teach it in an undergraduate money and banking class. And unfortunately now we have a Nobel Prize, so I may be forced to do that. People will require you to do that. That it's very interesting, you know, that both Diamond Dybvig and Bernanke article that got the Nobel Prize were published in like 1982, 1983, you know, so that's exactly when I was starting my PhD program. So I was, it was clear that the profession was ringing the wagons around, this is where we're going, you know, this is going to be the new orthodoxy. And that's been a problem for me my whole life. Okay, is that I didn't like DSGE, I didn't know, so I've had to find my own way. And Kindleberger helped me, you know, really. He's an inspiration as well as a knowledgeable about the world. I see are there questions in the chat? Should I be looking at that?
So I had,
yeah.
I guess, you know, going back to the first point you made around the difference that you lay out between you and Kindleberger, where it's about the survival constraint and not the price system.
Yeah.
So I thought one of the main things that I took away that I was like, oh, this was quite illuminating was, you know, the directionality that people usually get wrong, that they think money expands and then prices change. And then Kindleberger thinks, oh, actually, sometimes it's, or many times it's the reverse. So I thought that was actually quite illuminating. But then you started saying that the main difference that you have is the survival constraint versus the price system. So I just wanted you, if you could perhaps expand on what the differences you see between what you believe and what Kindleberger believed.
Well, I don't know that I have a difference. Again, I just think it's more analytically sharp and refined. The endogeneity of money, okay, is sort of what you're talking about there. That obviously I agree with that too. And why? Okay, it's because once you understand that banking is a swap of IOUs, the essential operation of the swap of IOUs, that money is just the highest form of credit. Okay, and so that credit is endogenous. If two people, if I want to, you know, write an IOU and you want to accept it and give me a good, you know, the money supply, nothing the Fed does prevents us from doing that. You know, we can do personal credit is not constrained by bank reserves, and in general, credit is not constrained by bank reserves. Okay, so that's where the endogeneity comes from, and I think that was Kindleberger's view, and that's my view. What I mean by the price system, that little throwaway line, was that the Walrasian image or Erogebura image of what a market economy is, okay, is that there are you know, supply curves that are coming from the structural production, there are demand curves that are coming from these utility curves and so forth, and that what coordinates the market system is supply equals demand, so that the price is moving around in order to give signals about relative scarcity and so forth. And that's why the market system works. Okay, and I think that's in general not true. Okay, first of all, there's too many prices. The information demands of that. I think what's happening is that people have their own, you know, interface with the market system, and that interface is a cash inflow outflow interface. Okay, and you are watching that interface, and when you're having a negative cash flow, you realize, you know, I'm not properly connected to this system. I got to do something. I got to change something. I have to consume less. I have to produce more. I have to produce something different. It's not just a signal. Also, it forces you. This is another thing. that's not just a signal, this reserve flow, it forces you to do something because you're going to hit the survival constraint, right? So you have to adapt to the market system, okay? So you see, it's a much more personal and it's a much stronger reason for coordination of the market economy. That everyone is confronting this daily survival constraint. And you can relax it maybe, and the bank can help you relax it, but that just means they now are confronting it. And they're aware of that, and they're going to behave in a certain way. So it's not that prices don't matter, but it's that this emphasis on the vector of equilibrium prices. It's not an equilibrium system. It's certainly not an intertemporal equilibrium system. So what makes it work? Why isn't it more anarchic than it is? Okay, and that's why I say the survival constraint. And the dealer function just takes that into time, so it's pricing promises to pay in the future, and so it projects that discipline from the future back into the present. What is the current price of these promises to pay? And that's quite a different vision than the Walrasian equilibrium idea, which has been the guiding vision for the entire post-war period, both on the right and on the left. The left saw Walrasian equilibrium as a kind of possible, big computer for a planned economy, okay? And the right saw it as a positive description of how markets actually do work, and they still argue about that. Should we use it as a computer, or should we just let her rip, but if the world is not actually a Walrasian equilibrium, then what? How do we? And the fact that Arrow de Breuer has no place in it for money, that there's no, money is a problem for the DSGE model, tells you there's something very crucial that is missing from our standard frame. And you can't just paste it in with money supply, money demand. It doesn't really work. This is what Han told us a long time ago. And DSGE just gives it up and says, okay, we'll just say that the Fed controls the nominal interest rate, okay? And that then is projected onto prices through an intertemporal transversality condition. And we'll give up on monetary theory, really, okay? And so I'm trying not to do that. This reminds me, so you had the conversation last time about Charlie's view, so about prices and quantities, okay, that in a fixed exchange rate system, all imbalances have to be absorbed in credit, right? So that if you're running a deficit, somebody has to lend you the money to do that. In flexible exchange rate systems, some of that can be absorbed in price, that the exchange rate moves a little bit. So maybe one of the things I disagree with Charlie about, he was a fixed exchange rates person, right? And I think with a deeper understanding of forward markets, you can realize that the system we have right now, okay, is not a fixed exchange rate system, but the way that FX swap markets work, and the way that the liquidity swaps between central banks put a band around covered interest parity, that is, I think, enough. That's enough. You don't need a fixed exchange rate system. And that system is, I think, more resilient than fixed exchange. It's less brittle because you can absorb some of the pressure in the movement of exchange rates, without losing the exchangeability of goods. Now, some countries aren't a part of that system, and so their currency falls off a cliff, Argentina or whatever, and so that's right. But at the core of the system, it's not a fixed exchange rate system, and I think it doesn't need to be. Okay, so Charlie was wrong about that. Right? He had their sort of a too bifurcated view, and that's probably because he was thinking of the analogy of the United States. Like, we really wouldn't want to have a California dollar and a New York dollar that that are moving against each other, even if it's not very much moving against each other. You know, when there's balanced trade problems between California and New York, you know, we want par inside a country. Okay, that doesn't mean that we need par globally. That doesn't follow. Okay, but that's where he was starting, because he was starting from that analogy. That was one of the big aha moments, I should say, for writing the book, when I realized, you know, I think that he is just taking his life mission from Willis. You know, he never says that anywhere, you know, but you can sort of see it. You know, once you have read Willis, you notice, you know, that there's echoes in Kindleberger. He may not even have been aware that he was doing that, you know. So that's just my interpretation of him. It's another way in which I'm very different than Kindleberger. Kindleberger would never have written a book like this. You know, WASPs do not talk about themselves. You know, they're not introspective at all. You know, have you read his biography? It's really very flat. His autobiography. He wrote an autobiography.
Well, you turned us off from it. I think
Well, you can read it now. You can read it now, and I think you'll be kind of amazed. You know, yeah. So read it, Alex, and tell me what you think about it. He doesn't even talk about his work, really. You know, it's just one fact after another. It's like, you know, there's no real story here. You know, and I think it's because he wrote it really fast. He wrote it really fast. And he wanted to, you know, in that transition when he was moving from Lincoln to the assisted living place, and he just pushed it out. But I think more time, he probably wouldn't have been able to write any better, because he's just not able to look at his, you know, he is of the school, you know, don't look back, you know, they're gaining on you. You know, so you're just keep moving. You know, that was how he survived, was whatever happens, just keep moving, don't keep banging your head against a wall. Okay, find another way, tunnel under it, go around it. You know, do something else. Right. That's what he. I
think Matthew has a question.
Yeah.
I do. So when it came to describing you and Charlie as sort of wishy-washy liberals, I was coming more from like a radical leftist perspective, if you will. The reason why I combined both of you is, number one, partially because it is hard to disentangle them when you're writing about it in that book. You hit the nail on the head there. But the other reason was because I was also drawing from some of your earlier work, in which case you referred to the hierarchy of money as a natural hierarchy, and this called to classical liberal ideas of natural rights and things like that, but also various other ideas of classical liberal ideas of hierarchy. And the sort of comment that I have is that I think the weakest part of the book is the politics, and that I think someone with a background in political science and colonial history could likely write a scathing rebuttal of it. Now, I'm not that person. I'm rusty with my political science, but I think that is a very big weak part of it. And even your some of the characteristic, some of how you characterize politics in the book too. You talk about economists not being very humble. I have this one line that I drew out this morning, actually, that's in the book. Thankfully for the scholar, the economic system is more amenable to scientific understanding than the political. And the whole context there is actually
this was Kindleberger. I was describing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's good that you're able to correct me on that. But still, I do sort of get this sense throughout that whole context that political science and politics is beneath economics.
Well, I mean, I am trained as an economist, okay,
Mm.
not as a political scientist, and so was Charlie, okay,
Mm.
and he, you know, from the very beginning of his life, you know, at MIT, he was trying to engage with the political scientists, or trying to get some help from them or something, because he thought that you needed both, okay, from the very beginning, he thought you needed both, but he only really had one of those things. I think the political scientists at MIT at that time were a big disappointment to him, you know, and you can see who they were. I'm not going to say names there. And so he wound up having to write this himself. His book, Power and Money, or Money and Power, Power and Money, it was sort of textbook, was an attempt to engage the political science in a way, but it didn't lead anywhere. So maybe I'm also going to pique the interest of political scientists, and maybe they'll write scathing. Jonathan Kirshner, who wrote a blurb on the back, you know, was a big fan of Kindleberger, and he's a political scientist, okay, now at Boston College. And of course, you know, the IPE people all claim Kindleberger as their forefather, but I think they don't understand him, you know, and so I think there will be some debate with them about that. That's one of the spin-offs I have in mind, that the Cohen and Nye and Gilpin and so forth, that whole crowd, but Kindleberger never corrected them, never said, no, you got me wrong. And I think that's, again, who he was, that it's like, well, I wrote it, you know, make use of it or don't make use of it, whatever, you know, I'm not going to insist. And I do that too, really, you know, but I want to talk about this natural thing. So I'm very sympathetic to this, you know, because of this evolutionary character, right? There's not like one best way that is coming into being, and we're not at the highest point of history or anything like that. That language does carry with it a lot of freight. Okay. One of the reasons that I use that in the draft, not in the published version, but it annoyed people. It annoyed people in the draft too. And one of the reasons I did was precisely in order to counter another naturalizing narrative, you know, the Mengerian kind of naturalizing narrative or something like that, on their own grounds, okay, to say that this is, I'm not, as opposed to attacking the, you know, sort of using that language. Maybe you remember the very first line of that paper, okay, was money is always and everywhere a hierarchical. So that's my distorted quote of Milton Friedman, okay, that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. So I'm saying money is always and everywhere a hierarchical phenomenon. So I'm exactly counterposing these two things. Now that works for some audiences, and it makes other audiences annoyed. And I'm sympathetic with that annoyance. And that's why when I volunteered to change it to inherent hierarchy, or that it's or maybe I should have said emergent hierarchy or something. That the point being that there's you know, you need to get away from the way economists think about the world, which is that it's flat, okay? That there's n countries, and we'll just use different letters for them. You know, it's like, no, there aren't n countries, okay? There's a few here, there's a few here, there's a few here. They're hierarchically arranged, and you need to have a theory. If you want to have a theory of foreign exchange, I think you need to tell me which countries are we talking about. You know, don't have a, you know, are we talking about the United States and France? Okay. Are we talking about the United States and Zimbabwe? Okay. Are we talking about France and Zimbabwe? Those are three different theories, I think.
So I think Matthew still wants to come back into it, but let me just get to points of involvement from both sides. Me also sympathetic to radical views. I think it's an objection to one naturalizing, but also to power being the way power is being described or naturalized, if you will. And I think the one thing maybe to help the conversation along is for Matthew to sort of see how it's not the one thing that is a challenge to me as a leftist, if I can consider myself that, that power is not something that is imposed by the US, not the top-down power. It's something that is sort of emergent, if you will, like you say. It's sort of a buy-in by other actors into the system. So for me, that would be a really, if the story has legs, then it would be a challenge for me as a leftist to sort of say, okay, how I power of my own population wanting to hold dollars to participate in this dollar system. And me not having monetarity as such in the way that I believe, right? So I think that's how I read this sort of objection. So just to see where it's coming from our perspective, if we allow that. But Matthew, just to help that conversation along, is that something that you feel is there's a challenge to Kindleberger here, but for us, there's an equal challenge that Kindleberger poses, which is, how do we actually, where do we identify the power or the exertion of power in the system? Where's it coming from?
Yeah, I think, he had probably too high opinion of the people who were managing the United States, or maybe that was aspirational, or he was remembering the New Deal, because I think that the people he worked with in the New Deal, his heroes, in the State Department, he thought, these are really high moral, fine individuals. They're trying to save the world, and I'm trying to help them. And this was a good war. World War II fought against, so there's this idealist sort of conception of what government is capable of doing, of what people in government are capable of doing, and the people he worked with, that he never went back and checked to see if that was real. Okay, later on, I mean, he was against the Vietnam War. Okay, he thought that was stupid, but he wasn't a protester. Really, he was good friends with Walt Rostow, okay, who some people maybe consider a war criminal, but he was a good historian, and they were good friends. He had lots of friends on the left. One of the spin-offs I want to do is, this is very unusual, that he's engaging with, he wrote a whole book that was inspired by Prevesh, okay, on the terms of trade. He wrote a whole book that was inspired by the Lewis model, okay, of development, the one on surplus labor populations, okay. He engaged with Paul Sweezy. Paul Sweezy was in the OSS with him. They were lifelong friends and debaters, and the list goes on. I mean, he wrote an article, even, maybe my mentor Steve Margin wrote a famous article called "What Do Bosses Do?" and he wrote a critique of that. He took it seriously as history and said, is it really correct as history? Let's go and let's look at how industry was organized back in England at that time and so forth. So he's very determined to engage with the left. Polanyi, he wrote a critique of Polanyi, as well. So he's critical of the left, okay, but he's not dismissive of them. That's extremely, I think, important difference, okay. That he and his critique of the new international economic order also, that he is very sympathetic. He understands that it doesn't feel good to be at the bottom of the hierarchy, okay, and that to be an underdeveloped nation is to be confronted with an enormous challenge. The development challenge is not a small one at all, and so he's sympathetic to that, but he's not a critique of the system. He's not anti-capitalist, and he's, in fact, sometimes he thought, that he critiqued, the left is multinational corporations. He thought might be a force for good given that they're global, as opposed to the nation state, which has blocked all of the tendencies for integration of the global system. The multinational corporation is breaking down those blocks. So that's not something that endears him to the left, okay? But he, anti-globalism, he's not an anti-globalist, he's a pro-globalist. Okay, he's a globalist, but not of a very different kind than the neoliberals, okay? Because he thinks the system's inherently unstable. It has to be managed, right? It's not going to be, so he was a world government guy, actually, is what he was. And he thought the nation state was a goner, actually, after World War II, that it had no future, that it was really going to be world government. And that turned out not to be true. And I think it was a disappointment to him that it turned out not to be true. So it's an interesting, I'm not sure that I agree with those things, but so politics, this is all just a roundabout way of saying that he didn't know quite what to do about politics, but he knew that it was key. Okay, and so that's why I named the book this, Money and Empire, to at least raise the question. Okay, and if somebody comes and writes a scathing takedown of it, well, then we're starting a conversation. Okay, and that's fine. That's fine. I've written the best book I can write, okay? And I doubt that if I had, read lots of colonial history, I would have written much more differently, because the whole idea is to get inside this head, okay? And in a sympathetic way, but not in a hagiographic way, to say, well, what, how does this mind work? What does it see? And of course it has blind spots too. Okay, and that's what you're pointing out there. I mean, in his career, the big question, okay, was the US and Europe, right? He's writing a financial history of Western Europe, right? So that's the big question, is can these countries kind of get it together to stop fighting world wars? That's the big question, okay? And the other questions were of smaller order than that. If you can't get that to work, you're not going to get anything to work. So that's why he was focused there at the core of the system. Maybe you saw that we could write more about his relationship with Heimer and all of those books. I mean, I'd pass over them in one paragraph. That would be a big spin-off to do, is all those books about the multinational corporation and so forth. That I don't, because I'm trying to follow the money line, right? When he kind of loses interest in the multinational corporation, I lose interest in the multinational corporation. So, but that doesn't mean that it's not an interesting line to follow. Okay, that could be a spin-off. Probably I won't write it, but somebody else might write it. Alex points out that I got Heimer's death date wrong. I don't know how I managed, where I got that. It's a couple years off, but I'll correct that in the next edition. There's I found 4 other small errors so far, and I'm sure there'll be more. So the politics, I agree that it's underdeveloped, okay, but it was underdeveloped in Charlie too. So it was, but that's the direction that it needs to go. I'm not sure that the political scientists that talking with the political scientists would necessarily have helped, but maybe it would have helped to talk to a colonial historian or something like that. So I don't think he was very keen on the people in political science who claimed him as an ancestor. He didn't say no, okay, but I don't think he made any effort to really engage with them. I know there's a little bit of correspondence with Susan Strange, okay, that's kind of it. I saw no correspondence with Cohen, he or Gilpin or Nye, and I doubt that he would have liked them much, because these are America Firster types in some way, and he is not that person. He's cosmopolitan.
Just to keep this conversation going, what I will say about the politics is that what it's refreshing that he's able to open, like you said, Perry, keep multiple lines open and find other dimensions than the typical ones. We've had many dimensions within monetary theory, but those dimensions are clear, that he's able to sort of be in contact and find ways beyond the standard lines to talk to many different people and keep many possibilities in his mind. I think that's a very refreshing way, because that at least opens up the possibility that things can evolve in a number of different directions. But I want to bring maybe the conversation back to the high-level questions that we've been raising in the discussion, and also your document you've given us previously, Perry. The thing that you add is, of course, an analytical lens, which you've now brought out in this document as well. And I think two things. We kind of stumbled over this question of also in the previous discussion, real versus monetary. So that's a stumbling block that we keep running into in our conversation. I think it might be helpful for us to have a better conceptual understanding how you frame this conversation. We know that you said previously the survival constraint, there's nothing more real than that. You've mentioned earlier this interface aspect, so a relational aspect that you have of individuals with the system that goes just the price, but it's cash inflow, cash outflow. But can we generalize that too? So is there an inventory question? Is there a balance sheet view? Can you really take prices out of the equation or money out of the equation for that matter? But that's just one of the key discussions we had this morning. But the second thing I would just like to say, maybe just raise it right now, you can get to it later, is this counterfactual is sort of all these things, the standard account and the Charlie account are really interesting because it might point to the fact that we might even view or misinterpret with these frames events that happen because they're close enough, but still different enough to sort of interpret the history, if you will, in a way that we like. Now, I would like to maybe ask you, after we answer the first point, where does this sort of counterfactual appear the most, right? So where, for example, how can we keep misinterpreting this international monetary story? In which accounts do you see it most clearly that there's a divergence between Charlie's story and the standard account? Because
maybe what's the unifying thread where his revisionist history, like, is there a common thing that kind of connects all of his differences between his version and the kind of standard version? Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, well, I think it is the in his case it's more implicit, in my case more explicit, that he really is a money view guy. Okay, that's the common thread. Okay, that he is thinking of the world in the money view sort of way, but internationally. Okay, not within a country. So it shows up in a different way. The real versus monetary. So certainly there's no classical dichotomy. I mean, the money views tells you that says that the fabric of the market system is monetary and financial. That is actually the web. These promises to pay are the web that gives order to the chaos. Okay, so that it is fundamental for everything that happens in the economy. There's no dichotomy, no dichotomizing at all. It's the reason the system works at all is because of these organizing function of these promises to pay. Now, production, if you're coming into the real side, production is also a cash inflow, cash outflow operation, right? That you're buying inputs, you're messing with them, you're creating outputs, you're selling them. So MCM prime, and there's time and the lining up of your, that's a way to interact with the world too. That is non-financial, where you're doing something in a factory or somewhere in order to generate cash flows in the future. Okay, and those cash flows in the future are discounted back to the present, and that gives you your stock price. So the fact, it's not that prices don't matter. Prices matter because the price of your output is the cash flow, right? And that price, if that price turns out not to be enough to cover your costs, then you have a problem. Okay, you're losing money, and you can't lose money for very long before you go out of business. So the normal, I emphasize liquidity kills you quick, right? That's the survival constraint. Solvency also kills you, but insolvency also kills you, but it kills you slower. Okay, you can be insolvent for a long time as long as you're liquid. Okay, and many banks live for years in really insolvent if you actually did mark to market on all of their assets. So I am working on, one of the sort of big holes in the money view is that there's not really a satisfactory, to my mind, theory of the price level, what I call the fourth price of money. And what we know, I mean, I think a proper understanding of money makes it pretty clear that the quantity theory of money is not the answer. But that just means you need something else. Okay, and I think we are. I'm working on this. As a matter of fact, this is one of my goals. And where, so I was just talking about production. So production is a cash inflow, cash outflow process, okay, but it's also somewhat flexible, right? That you can speed it up, you can slow it down, you can have storable inventories, if you can't sell. And so there you can decide, do I want to turn these inventories into cash now, or can I wait? And so there's flexibility there. And a lot of sort of supply chain management is about that. So you could think about production from a money view point of view. Okay. And I think that's maybe where you're going to get prices into the picture. A lot of another idea is some certain products, okay, have very little flexibility. I think like agricultural products, because there's an actual harvest cycle, okay? And not surprisingly, it was these products that Charlie emphasized in the world in the world in depression, where basically the price just fell off a cliff. Okay, and because there had been dealers that were absorbing these inventories, trying to wait, and then when they couldn't finance them anymore, they had to dump them. So there's a connection between the real and the monetary, right? Is the ability of commodity dealers in world markets, to absorb or to discharge surpluses. So things like the strategic oil reserve. It's kind of surprising, isn't it, that what Biden did with the strategic oil reserve actually moved the price of oil. It's like, this isn't actually very much. It wasn't, it wasn't quantity wise very much, okay? But it moved the price of oil. That's sort of interesting. And I don't think you would expect that if you had a supply demand story, okay? But if you're thinking of oil as an asset, as a moving through time, possibly you can understand where this comes from. So that's on the other side. There were spiking prices, but falling prices. Kindleberger had a view about, which I think I would like to begin with as a possible, beginning of a theory of price. Okay, that that it is pressure on supply and demand that causes prices to move and money adjusts. Okay, that's what Lurso was saying. He even viewed that about the gold. I mean, I put this in the book, right? About gold discoveries in the New World, right? That it's not the gold discoveries in the New World that led to prices rising. It was prices rising that led to gold scarcity, and therefore hunting for gold in the New World. I don't know if that's true, but it's an extreme argument, compared to the normal economic history argument. But inventories are going to be key, because then the good is it's an asset, right? And it's maybe a depreciating asset, okay, but it may be appreciating if the price is going to be better later on. Hawtrey talks about this. If you look at currency and credit, it's really about commodity dealers, and that's what he thought was causing business cycles. So I think there's some starting points there that you could connect to the real and the monetary. It's not. My attempt is not to say that that everything everything in the real side is determined by the monetary side. The problem is the real nominal split to begin with. Yes, exactly. I'm not making any real nominal split. Neither did he. Right? That's an illusion, and it's not a helpful illusion. I don't know why we insist on teaching this to the undergraduates. Here's another piece of heresy. That we want to look at real GDP. Talk about a constructed number. Do you know what goes into making that number? Really, come on. It means GDP even by itself is all these imputed flows, and and even what do we mean by the price level? You see the argument now. Do we have inflation? How much inflation? Well, what do you mean by inflation? What do you mean? It's not at all clear to me that the CPI is the right measure. From a point of view of thinking about the relationship between production and money. It may be that what you want is a much narrower, like inputs. You want a wholesale price index or something.
What do you mean by inflation?
Well, I don't know yet. I have to work on that. That's what I'm working on. But
okay.
But I think it's very important to appreciate that price is a complex, right? That the price level is a manufactured idea. So what you need is a theory of where did the price of individual goods come from and how they're related to each other. So I'm reading right now Isabella Weber's paper about input-output structure of inflation, thinking that there's some prices that are strategic, that if those prices move, lots of other prices are going to move, like energy or something like that.
You don't think there's something useful about thinking about the purchasing power of the money itself, like the monetary instrument or instruments and the
depends on what you want to purchase, though.
Well, I don't know. Do you ever think about the price level in terms of kind of the stability of the monetary standard itself?
So here's what's Charlie's view about this, okay, which I'm starting with in this project too, which is that in general, the price level is something that's sort of drifting or it's fluctuating. You worry about this when it comes unhinged, okay? And he really did view the 1930s is a time when it came unhinged, okay? And it was because of breakdown of the international monetary system. And we got deflation and it was horrible. It was really horrible, okay? The other time when it came unhinged was the 1970s, okay? And then we got inflation and that wasn't really very good either. And again, it was because of chaos in the international monetary system. So he would say, you're not really gonna get, you need these price changes to feed on each other through the exchange rate mechanism, okay, in order to get it continuing. This is why you have inflation at the bottom of the hierarchy, right? Because they lose control of their currency, right? The currency plummets, right? And but the international monetary system is not in trouble right now, okay? And so that's why I've been a team temporary person from the beginning. Like, it seems like it's okay. And so I think that this is just, we're coming out at the end of a war, things are all messed up, supply chains, everything. And so there's going to be bottlenecks but I don't think that this is going to undermine anything. It may break and we'll see. The reason people focus on CPI is for welfare reasons, right? It's to say, what does your wage buy you? And that's why they focus on that. And so they're looking at the consumer basket. And so that's a reasonable thing to do, is to ask, what does your wage buy you? And it buys you less than it did before. That's not good. You've just experienced a real wage fall. That's all correct. I think that there are good reasons to experience real wage falls, though. I think that the economy is going to be less global. There's going to be less efficiency. I think there's going to be standard of living effects that are going to be real wage effects. And the way you lower real wages in this economy is by raising prices, not by lowering nominal wages. So, that's, so when that's done, then I think it will stop. so these are just me muttering on about things that I would like to understand. I'm pretty sure that I feel that the beginning of wisdom in thinking about the price level is to realize that we don't have a good theory of it.
So I'm not sure how much time we want to spend. I'm happy to stay on for a bit longer, but
I got to ring
Harry,
off at 1:30 because I'm going to see Tom at 2 o'clock. But
great. So we have 10 minutes at a max. So I think just to reframe my earlier question about and it connects up to something we're going to do at the Money View Symposium, which is about accounting, which is what are we actually counting and where do pressures show up? I think this is something that maybe is a red thread that Charlie would really put emphasis on different. So what is Charlie's account of the international system, putting sort of a banking, sort of an international credit view of the international system, and how do we have to count things differently away from national accounts? How would you sort of preface that conversation, maybe as a starter? And I think we have a bunch of conversations still in the chat, but I think maybe just to accommodate them, I think there is also a hierarchy of things that have to happen, right? Sort of when we talk about equity, I think it's not helpful to think about all problems at once, but there's a hierarchy of things about an international public good, which is the dollar, and that has to be managed in some way. And then other problems are secondary to that when we talk about the unbanked, both domestically and internationally, right? I think those are or class questions, which I think I mentioned earlier. Jakob Fagan has those class of people interacting with the dollar system in a lot of different countries are a very privileged class, and they are sort of the ones intermediating in that system. We talk about class structures, and then of course other dimensions as well. But Perry, you can sort of interact with these questions as you like for the last couple minutes.
So the accounting question. The last thing that Charlie ever wrote about this was the article in the JPE that's also in his final collection of essays. And that's mostly really confined to the point that for a country like the United States, that is an international reserve country that is doing international financial intermediation. Okay, the standard way of doing international financial accounts is very misleading. Okay, now it might not be misleading for other countries. So you don't necessarily want to do the accounting the same for every country. You want to be paying attention to what they're doing. Now, I think that article is like from 1970 or something. So this is really before the financial globalization and so forth. So I think there's a lot more that would have to be said about that. And some of that is being said by the BIS, you know, their emphasis, they have all of this data on cross-border banking flows that they're trying to figure out what it means and measure it. They're concerned, you know, as you know, about off-balance sheet exposures that have cash flow consequences, like FX swap exposures, and they're and how should we you know, if they have all this dark debt that is driving things, then we need to measure it and make it not dark. And I think we're going to talk about some of that, you know, at the Money View Symposium. I haven't promised to give a paper on the fourth price of money at the Money View Symposium because I don't think I have a paper yet on that. But I am going to talk about why is the Money View a minority view? Why is it? Can we expect it ever not to be a minority view, or what? And that I think I would like to ponder a little bit, and that's one of the reasons that I'm interested in hearing your, you know, how you read the book, and see what you make of it, and I don't know if I haven't addressed all the things that you.
I have a question, which is, kind of specific, but in chapter 6, Kindleberger, you mentioned that Kindleberger seems to emphasize the importance of gold's convertibility into dollars rather than the other way around. He talks about, going off gold being about depriving gold's unlimited convertibility into dollars. And that's a little bit confusing to me because we're used to thinking about it going the other way. Do you have a sense of what he was getting at?
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I wasn't trying to be obscure.
No. Yeah.
The point is that he just as the sterling standard, sterling was convertible into gold, but the important thing was that it was that everything was convertible into sterling. Sterling was money. Sterling was international money. So the dollar is international money. And so if you have some gold and you want to buy something with it, you got to convert it into dollars in order to buy something with it. So that's all he's saying.
But even if you
gold is not money, dollars are money.
But if you go off gold, you can convert gold into even more dollars when the dollar depreciates. So it's not. I don't really understand why the value of gold comes from it.
Gold has a price. So do automobiles have a price. Everything has a price, and so gold is special because banks are holding it as a reserve. They're not holding used automobiles as a reserve, and so the price of gold has some importance there. But I think all he's saying there, he's trying to use this sort of strange language precisely to draw your attention to the fact that you're assuming that gold is money. That's why you're finding it hard to read, because you're assuming that gold is better money than the dollar, and he's saying no, the dollar is better money than the gold. So that's why there's not going to be a run on the dollar. What would you run to? There's that. This is it. The dollar is the world currency. So the notion that somehow the gold leaving the United States. I mean, chapter 6 is the Triffin chapter, right? That the famous Triffin diagram in Gold of the Dollar Crisis, where he shows the gold reserves of the United States going down and the foreign liabilities going up and crossing in 1959. That's like the moment. Oh no. If all foreigners withdrew their bank accounts from New York tomorrow, we wouldn't have enough gold to cover it all, and therefore we would be bankrupt, and we would be. So that's the Triffin point of view. And he's saying, well, first of all, the U.S. is a bank, and that you're saying you have to have 100% reserves, in order to back anything. That's crazy. No bank has 100% reserves. And secondly, you're imagining that they're going to prefer gold to the dollar. And why would they do that? They would do that because they believe Triffin, and Triffin is not helping the situation by encouraging the French to be irresponsible, and by encouraging.
Well, perhaps if they're expecting a devaluation of the dollar vis-a-vis gold. I mean, that's maybe the hot money argument that he's. But
if you just go off gold, then that's that. And so he, throughout, even in the 20s, even in the 30s, he at the Fed, he and Dupre were talking about demonetizing gold throughout, just as inside countries we've demonetized gold, right? You don't see gold coins anymore, right? You can't go to the bank and demand gold. Okay, the same logic applies internationally.
It's still not clear to me why depriving gold's convertibility into the dollar would have any effect, because if you could always go into the market and sell some gold for dollars.
Yeah.
And
it just means
get a better price.
The central bank is not standing ready to do unlimited business. It's not fixing the gold price.
Well, why does he emphasize that direction rather than the other direction of depriving the dollar's convertibility into gold?
What page are you looking at?
152.
And you're looking at let the gold go part, or?
Hold on, let me bring it up here. Yeah, so it's
Oh, here, okay. So
Yeah.
it's that quote, the footnote 53 here.
Yeah.
So just read the whole passage there. This is a partial, or this is just this is the passage that I am characterizing as contemplating partial or complete demonetization of gold. Okay, and so there's three things: widening the margin around parity at which it buys and sells gold. Okay, so that's outside spread. Okay, so that if you are doing gold business with the central bank, you're going to be losing money. Okay, in general, because you're going to be selling at the high price and buying selling at the low price, buying at the high price. That's what, and the central bank will be taking the opposite side of that trade. That's one way. Instead of doing business at par, which is a very narrow spread, inside spread, right? Then you're fixing the price. Okay, so this is an outside spread argument, the first one, I would call it. He doesn't have that language. Reducing the price at which it buys gold. So that's just depreciating gold, otherwise depriving gold of its present unlimited convertibility into gold. So the unlimited convertibility, so that a central bank that fixes the price of gold is doing that. It's creating unlimited convertibility of gold into dollars. Because if you have gold, you can get dollars for however much gold you want. And he's saying that the central bank needs to move away from that's too strong. That's too strong. Don't guarantee par, do wider, okay? Or say you're not gonna buy gold at that price, you're gonna buy at a lower price, lower than the market price, and so no one will come to you. If the central bank says I'll buy gold at $30 and the London gold market is selling at 40, then no one comes to the central bank.
Okay, and then you have even more of a gold drain from the central bank, right?
No one comes to the central bank.
They're not going to sell gold to the central bank.
Oh, you mean they will try to get their gold? They'll convert.
This reads to me like you're constraining the central bank's ability to boost its gold reserves or something like that.
Well, he doesn't think that central banks sort of need gold reserves. So,
but I guess if the issue at hand is not that the Fed is getting too much gold pumped into it, so it's not clear to me.
The issue at hand is that the gold is leaving, right? This is what Tritton is saying. The gold is leaving, and he's saying let it go.
So the main issue, if I understand you correctly, Perry, is to say there's not a sufficient balance sheets to which that would then be monetized in another currency that is of value, that is competing with the dollar, that would be sufficient. So for example, for all this, that's why the gross view is important, because we're talking about such enormous amounts of gold that have to leave for this to be a danger. This would have to be sold off to France, Britain, Germany, and then therefore be monetized in that currency, which will never happen because there's not enough. If the Fed or those currencies are not ready to buy, there is no market actually to sell this gold reserve into those markets, right? So I think the fact is that we're talking about overwhelming these markets in which the gold would be sold, right? That's the main point. It's just too big, and people don't even want to hold money in those currencies in the first place. So they will just stay in the dollar.
That's probably what he would say. I mean, I view this, I'm reading this through the lens of the Trainer model, right? And saying that a central bank should not be making the inside spread. Okay, it should be making the outside spread at most, and maybe it shouldn't be making any spread. What the Fed decides to buy and sell, it can buy and sell bonds and things like that. So it doesn't need to be operating only in gold. I'm going to have to run because it's 1:37.
Yeah. Okay. Then thank you very much.
Okay, but we've started a conversation. I'm happy to continue it. I'm going to see all of you at other times. So that's
we can, as a group, collect the questions and then maybe send them to email, or we can have another conversation very soon. But
all right,
until we see each other again, have a happy holidays. See you guys very soon.
All right.
Thanks so much for reading the book together.
Take care.
For coming
okay.
today.
Thank you.
Bye.